A pleasure to be here. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Since I have half an hour to discuss nutrition, cancer, and aging, I will not waste time. And in fact, have to even do more. It's said that the only real way to learn is first to unlearn things that you think you know. And that always seems to entail confusion. So I will not consider my job a success tonight, this afternoon, unless I have confused you. So remember that at the end. Let me move on. Here's the answer. It's really all you have to know. This is what I've said for many years, actually several decades. And that if I have to summarize everything in one sentence, it's this: that your health and lifespan will most be determined by the proportion of fat versus sugar you burn over a lifetime. You can gauge anything that you hear about nutrition with that statement. If it helps you burn fat, it's probably good. If it doesn't, it's probably not. And that will be determined by the communication of hormones. Okay? And those hormones will be determined by what you eat. So it's not this simple calories in, calories out. You eat to affect the hormones that will affect whether you burn sugar or whether you burn fat. In other words, every meal you eat is probably the most important effector of hormones that you will be exposed to that day, in that hour, in that minute. Now, 25 years ago, there were a handful or less of people who were recommending low carbohydrate. And the impetus for it really was to lose weight. And it was found that a low carbohydrate diet was very good for weight loss. The other handful of people, other than myself, were, as I say, looking to lose weight, or looking to affect weight loss. And a high protein diet worked very well. Plus, fat was really vilified at that time. I mean, it's still vilified, but if you can imagine a quarter of a century ago, fat was the Darth Vader of health. And so nobody would even attempt to think of eating a high-fat diet, except me. Because I was not dealing with weight loss. I didn't really care at all about weight loss. I wanted to treat diabetics and heart disease patients. And I knew that protein was very good at turning into sugar, and the diabetics, one of the major problems was gluconeogenesis, where they turned protein into sugar. So I could not see the point of feeding a diabetic a lot of protein, and certainly I didn't see the point of feeding a diabetic sugar and then giving them medication to get rid of that sugar. That made no sense whatsoever, okay? Which is still being done. So what's left? I mean, there's not a whole lot of choices here, right? So I went to a high-fat diet. It worked very well for diabetes, cardiovascular disease. And diabetes, in my studies, my background was the biology of aging, was really a model for accelerated aging. So I knew I was onto something. And the only thing that I think I've changed over the years has been just how important it is to restrict protein. In the book that I put out maybe a decade ago, a little over, the only nutrient I had people count was protein. So I knew it was important, but I would have to say that today, I would say it perhaps is more important to restrict protein than it is to restrict carbohydrate. And I know that's a new statement, but I told you I wanted to confuse you a little bit. And I'll hopefully be able to give a few reasons why in the next 20 minutes or so. But to do so, we have to go back. We have to go back pre-paleo. Now, paleo, what was that? Maybe 500 million years or something? When did paleo start? Not even then, right? A few hundred million? Yeah. Well, life started about 4 billion years ago. And that's really when the rules of eating began. Actually before that, but we won't go there. So let's quickly take an overview of life. We started out as single-cell organisms floating around the oceans, lots of them. Unicellular organisms whose requisite to stay alive was to divide. Divide as fast as you can and beat your neighbors to the punch. What does that sound like today? Cancer. Okay, that is the history of cancer. Okay? It is our bacterial heritage. Unicellular organisms were dividing, and that went on, by the way, for, 1.5 billion, maybe 2 billion years, half of our entire lifetime. The history of life was single-cell organisms flourishing in the oceans until one of them developed photosynthesis and started putting out oxygen into the atmosphere. Well, that killed about everything. There were no defenses. You talk about oxidation. That was the first major pollution crisis for life. It's estimated that at least 90% of all life was wiped out until one smart bacteria figured out a way to use that oxygen and burn organic material, food with it, which did wonderful things because it saved the organism from being oxidized and generated tons of energy. And then another unicellular bacterial entity, organism, ate that proto-mitochondria that we call mitochondria now, and they became friends. Where that proto-mitochondria got nice room and board in exchange for lots of energy. So then you had eukaryotes. And you had the ability then to fuel multicellular organisms. Multicellular organisms have a lot more genes. Not necessarily in each individual cell, but you have a lot of cells with a lot of genes, and they have to multiply. It took a lot of energy. That couldn't have occurred until you had that nice symbiotic relationship between one bacteria and a protobacteria and a lot of energy being formed and protection from oxidizing. So it was a great little symbiosis, probably the greatest event in the evolution of life, because that allowed for everything else, culminating, maybe if you want to call us a culmination, us. So it allowed multicellularity and a division of labor. And the greatest division of labor came between the genome, our genes, the information of life, and the other cells around it. The other cells around it, called the soma, its purpose is to protect that genome and pass it along. That's the purpose of the division of labor between genome and soma. Huge distinction and a huge event in the history of life. Why? Because that is why we die. There was no death until then. And the purpose of that soma is to protect that genome, pass it along, and then nature doesn't care, which is why we die. If nature doesn't care, we're going to die. It takes a lot of effort to stay alive. Now that tells us something that a lot of people don't realize, and this isn't going to be a very popular thing to say here. However, it tells us that we can study paleo all we want. And we can argue and debate what paleo man ate, and I will tell you, they won't tell us much. If we finally figure it out, all it will tell you is what diet did we evolve with that might have maximized our reproductive success, not what will give us a long post-reproductive lifespan. that nature doesn't care about, nor is there a way, even if there was something like a longevity gene, there'd be no way to pass it along, since the power of selection wanes quite rapidly post-reproductively. So we can't use nature in general to tell us how to live a long, happy, healthy life, because nature doesn't care. We're probably the only species, certainly on Earth, that's ever even thought about it. Nature's purpose is to get those genes passed along. But that also created a problem with the allocation of energy. As multicellular organisms flourished in the oceans, there was competition in an arms race, especially for food. It wasn't so plentiful anymore. They had to compete. But that also meant you had to use it wisely. And you had to decide, do we have enough food to replicate, to reproduce, or do we direct our resources to staying alive? That's what nature cares about. Nature will keep us alive long enough such that we have a sufficient opportunity to pass our genome along. And that nature has a lot of tricks to do that. It will upregulate DNA repair, heat shock proteins, intracellular antioxidants, all sorts of cool stuff that nature has that will keep us alive so that we can pass our genetic information to the next generation. And we want to do is apply that science post-reproductively. In other words, what does nature do that allows us to be healthy such that we can take care of our genome and pass it along so that we can use that knowledge and continue using it post-reproductively? It has nothing to do with paleo. So that's the why we age, mostly because nature doesn't care that we do. The how we age is a little bit of a different story. You can consider aging to be a competition between damage and repair of damage. If we could repair damage as fast as it occurred, we would live forever. However, our repair mechanisms become damaged too over time, and that's why we don't. And we can't stop that damage. Now, there's deep reasons we can't stop that damage. One being we can't stop breathing. And so you hear about antioxidants. Well, your best antioxidant would be to not breathe. Yeah. But it wouldn't get you very far. And we glycate. Glucose combines with proteins and DNA and gums up the works. You know, the food industry is called caramelization. You know, oxidation is called rancidity. So we turn rancid and we caramelize with age. Okay. That's the how. But because we had to allocate energy towards either repairing damage, and repairing damage is really where it's at. We're not going to stop damage. You're much better off at upregulating repair of damage. We know that we can do that. We can do that because all life apparently has mechanisms to allow our cells, or single cells, to outlast a nutrient deprivation, a famine. So some organisms will go into a deep freeze. Some will desiccate and then come back to life at a future, more opportune, nutritionally advantageous time. And because of this competition for food and the choice between whether we should allocate our resources towards maintenance and repair, i.e. living longer, or investing those resources into replication or reproduction, there had to be nutrient sensors. There had to be something that says, how much food is there available to do this? And because this is so important, there are lots of them. We've got insulin, we know, IGF, and they're close cousins. In fact, they're one and the same in the early organisms. Worms, there's no such thing as a distinction between the two. They're just called IIF, insulin IGF. One and the same. And that's one, leptin. You've got energy itself, the ADP to ATP ratio, NAD to NADH ratio, AMPK, which is the enzyme involved in changing AMP to ATP. You have all these nutrient sensors, but to keep a cell from becoming schizophrenic, there had to be something that organizes all of this. And indeed there is. And it's called the mammalian target of rapamycin. Most people haven't heard of it. The most important pathway in your body. It will sense all of the nutrient sensors and decide, should this cell replicate or should it stay alive? And replicate at a future, more opportune time. That's what we want. TOR, the target of rapamycin, has been around since the beginning of animal life. It's found in bacteria. It way predates insulin. It started almost with life because that was such a critical decision. And now, let's see if we can get through some slides. Calorie restriction. We know that that's a mechanism that's been used since the 1930s to extend lifespan. And it slows aging, extends life. How? Well, a friend of mine actually received the first Methuselah Prize, which is given to the aging researcher that is able to keep a mouse alive the longest. He was able to double a mouse's lifespan from 2 to 4 years by inhibiting IGF receptors. So if you inhibit the growth of a mouse, it lives longer. In other words, if you inhibit IGF, there's a dichotomy apparently between growth, reproduction, and longevity. And that's what this slide shows. The role of insulin and IGF. Insulin and IGF represent a family of hormones, growth factors that regulate metabolism, growth, cell differentiation, and survival of most tissues in mammals. That's us. Insulin and IGF initiate their action via highly homologous signaling systems. Now, I left that in there because a lot of what we thought had to do with insulin signaling and extending lifespan wasn't really insulin, but IGF. They cross-react. High insulin is bad, and I talked about this 20 years ago, about the detriments of insulin and health, and still believe it. But the reason high insulin is so bad is because it also stimulates IGF receptors. It's a growth hormone. You also then become insulin resistant, but that insulin resistance, by the way, is more of the metabolic aspect. You become insulin resistant, but not the anabolic aspect. So the anabolic aspect of high insulin flourishes, while the insulin resistant cells are actually protected from the glycation. I stuck this in there too, again in this article, as a quote. Some of the common and consistent effects of calorie restriction in rodents and non-human primates include lower fat mass, particularly visceral fat, lower circulating insulin and IGF concentrations, increased insulin sensitivity, lower body temperature, lower fat-free mass, decreased levels of thyroid hormones, and decreased oxidative stress. So when people see that their thyroid hormones are going down a little bit when they follow a so-called ketogenic high-fat diet, and they're worried about, and you hear these blogs that say, you've got thyroid disease, not in the least. There's a very healthy way to live. You are running cooler. You are allocating more resources towards maintenance and repair and longevity. It is not thyroid disease, and I know that because your TSH does not go up, which is how you actually define hypothyroidism in medicine. So don't believe all that stuff. In conclusion, strong similarities exist between insulin and IGF in yeast, worms, flies, mammals, humans. Suggests that insulin and IGF arose early in evolution and is a central component of an anti-aging system which is conserved from yeast to humans. In other words, it's important Does it apply to people? Yes, it does. This is a family of people in Ecuador that have a very rare disorder known as LaRon Syndrome. They basically have exactly what the mice have in Andre Bartke's mice that live twice as long. They have an IGF mutation, IGF receptor mutation. Cancer and diabetes is unknown despite them being fat. Now, they have a very hard life. They die a lot of alcoholism and accidents. But if one controls for those, they also live lots longer. So if you control for kind of non-age-related diseases, they have a very long lifespan. In yeast, worms, and mice, restricting growth hormone could make those creatures live longer. Guevara, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is the one who kind of discovered this Ecuadorian family. It's a rare syndrome caused by a gene mutation. Over the course of his years with the family members, he noticed that people with LaRon syndrome almost completely avoided cancer and diabetes, an observation that squared with research of Longo and others who had done this in yeast and animals. It could be because cells must invest energy in either trying to grow and reproduce or in protection, i.e. maintenance repair. That's what I've been saying. So it's a huge decision, and we want to swing it towards maintenance repair. When we talk about cellular replication, we want to curtail that for the most part, right? Because then you curtail cancer. In nature, dwarf models live longer. Ponies live longer than horses. Small dogs live longer than large dogs. It's a very fascinating field, or fascinating field in aging. Ungrowth hormone increases longevity. It's a drug that counters growth hormone, and it inhibited several human cancers, including prostate, brain, breast, and lung cancers. Long-term effects of calorie or protein restriction on serum IGF and IGF binding protein. Our data provide evidence that protein intake is a key determinant of circulating IGF-1 levels in humans, and suggest that reducing protein intake may become an important component of an anti-cancer and anti-aging dietary intervention. There is a huge difference between a low-carbohydrate, high-protein diet and a low-carbohydrate, high-fat diet. Namely, one is healthy and one isn't. And so early on, when the few people 20, 25 years ago who were advocating low-carb, that was a kind of a revelation. It was good enough. But this distinction wasn't made between high-protein or high-fat, particularly. And virtually everyone else went to high-protein because fat was so vilified, and that really set it back because there were a lot of problems with high protein. And it worked, certainly for weight loss. And so the advantageous publicity was more for weight loss, not as much for disease and diabetes, and certainly not for cancer. But you didn't find that out for years. But now we know. An anti-Atkins low-protein diet extends lifespan in flies. Now Atkins, bless his soul, at least got low carbohydrate known. His deal was just low carbohydrate and pretty much anything else went, and since nobody wanted to eat fat back then, they all gravitated to high protein. That was a problem. It appears that high protein accelerates aging. Reducing protein extends life. Why? We've talked about insulin and IGF and all these different things that can extend life and affect health and longevity, and they all intersect at the mammalian target of rapamycin. Rapamycin is an antifungal agent that was discovered in the Easter island of Rapa. So they called it rapamycin. And they found it, well, it inhibits cancer. It's also an immune suppressant, and it's used to this day as an immune suppressant for organ transplantation, especially kidney transplantation. So people take rapamycin, which inhibits mTOR, and they found that those kidney transplantation patients who were taking rapamycin ended up having a far lower incidence of cancer, lo and behold. even though it inhibited immunity. In other words, there was something else there that was really working wonders as far as cancer. Okay, so this is what you're going to be quizzed on. Okay, now, amino acids affect TOR directly. Okay, no middleman. It doesn't have to affect hormones. It doesn't have to raise insulin or IGF. It just goes right to mTOR. Does not pass go. Okay, you've got insulin and IGF receptors. So you've got growth factors. See that at the very top? All the growth factors upregulate TOR. You've got glucose. Again, directly, it'll affect increased insulin, but all by itself, it increases TOR. Here's TOR. It's actually in two complexes, TORC1, TORC2. They do slightly different things. Okay? It's complicated. But it's been so important that it's been almost unchanged since bacteria. Okay? That's how ancient this is, and that's how important it is. And it is what regulates growth or not. And when you keep it down, you upregulate maintenance and repair. That translates to longevity. That's what we want. We want to keep it down. But we know that it began with bacteria, ancient life, and it senses nutrient availability. What are those nutrients that it evolved with? Glucose and amino acids. Those were the components and fuel necessary to replicate life. Okay? You keep those down, and you keep all these other things down that otherwise would increase mTOR and prevent this upregulation of the genetic expression of maintenance and repair. Okay? It's really quite elegant. We know that TOR is also largely responsible for something called autophagy. Autophagy is really important. It gets rid of the crap. So if you have malfunctioning proteins in your cells, you want to get rid of them before you can make new ones. Just like we purposely try and break down our bones so that we can rebuild our bones. Right? You have to get rid of the bad proteins to replace them with good proteins. You do that with autophagy. Part of that is also mitophagy. You can get rid of bad mitochondria so you can replace them with good mitochondria. That's largely controlled by mTOR. In all mTOR, from growth signal integration to cancer, diabetes, and aging, in all eukaryotes, that's us, the target of rapamycin signaling pathway couples energy and nutrient abundance to the execution of cell growth and division owing to the ability of TOR protein kinase to simultaneously sense energy, nutrients, and stress, and in metazoans, meaning animals, growth factors. In the past few years, a significant advance in our understanding of the regulation and function of mTOR has revealed the crucial involvement of this signaling pathway in the onset and progression of diabetes, cancer, and aging. I might also add obesity. When we say growth factor, when mTOR is upregulated, it makes you fat also. That's kind of a newer association between mTOR and health. Amino acids mediate the mTOR-RAPTOR signaling through activation of phosphatidylinositol kinase. We found that a major pathway by which amino acids control mTOR signaling is distinct from that of insulin. And there have been experiments recently to determine what are the most powerful signals that stimulate mTOR, and without question, the most powerful signal that stimulates mTOR are amino acids. In fact, there's nothing else you can do that if you eat excess protein and the cells are exposed to excess amino acids, you can be good about everything else. You can keep glucose down and insulin down and IGF down, and mTOR will still be elevated. That's how important restricting protein is. And that's why I say now, even though I knew 20, 25 years ago that restricting protein was important, now I would say it's even more important than restricting carbohydrates. And here we have it. The ratio of macronutrients, not calorie intake, dictates cardiometabolic health, aging, and longevity in ad libitum fed mice. Longevity and health were optimized when protein was replaced with carbohydrate to limit compensatory feeding for protein and suppress protein intake. The results suggest that longevity can be extended in animals that feed whenever they want to by manipulating the ratio of macronutrients to inhibit the mTOR activation. Now, they didn't test it against a high-fat diet. This was strictly testing carbohydrates versus protein. And they found that if they increased the carbohydrate, which then satiated the animal enough that they wouldn't eat extra protein, they lived longer. In other words, the protein restriction was more important than carbohydrate restriction. Here's a drug, Novartis, Afinitor, helps women with advanced breast cancer live longer. It's a protein. It targets mTOR in cancer cells, a protein that acts as an important regulator of tumor cell division, blood vessel growth, and cell metabolism. Resistance to hormonal therapy in breast cancer has been associated with overactivation of the mTOR pathway. And I might add now that almost all cancers upregulate mTOR. So we don't want to do that. And how do you not do it? Restrict protein. The best drug to reduce TOR signaling to slow aging and the chronic diseases associated with it is present. You don't need Afinitor. Reduce your protein intake. It doesn't mean that I want you to eat carbohydrates. No, no, no. What's left? Fat. You want to eat a high-fat diet. Okay. These are really compelling reasons for that. Now, I told you I wanted to leave you a little bit confused. So far, I've just given you answers. Can't just give you answers. But first, we'll talk about what's high. I used to say about a gram of protein per kilogram of lean body mass. In other words, estimate what your mass is without any fat. And as a fudge factor, you could have up to a gram of protein per kilo of lean mass per day. In diabetics, I would give 0.75. What I would say now is that everybody should have 0.75, and you can even go lower. Your body will conserve that protein. You will lower mTOR. You will increase maintenance and repair. And you will be healthier. Now, here's where you'll get confused. Ketone body utilization drives tumor growth and metastases. They have been finding, and this actually I think went around the paleo community, and everybody was scratching their heads and coming up with really, unfortunately, rather bogus excuses. I think that Eric Westman had the best comment on it when he said, cancer is complicated. Yes, it is. Okay. But there actually is an answer to this. And again, it's not going to ingratiate me to too many people. But it isn't ketogenesis really that we're after. It's fat burning. They're not the same. It's a high-fat diet. It's not the same. You can have a ketogenic diet by eating high protein. Okay. It isn't the ketones necessarily that give you the benefit. It's the fact that you're burning fat. The ketones are a byproduct. So you have to specify, if you're going to say a ketogenic diet, it's a high-fat ketogenic diet. And it's really the burning of the high fat that's of benefit. It's burning of the fatty acids. As a result, you will get ketones that your brain needs. They do good things too, and they signal. But you don't want to be after 4+ ketones in the blood. That's not what you're striving for. That's not why it's a good diet. So a ketogenic diet is a good diet, but not because it's ketogenic. It's because it's an indication that you are burning fat. And I'm going to just take questions.